Welcome to today's GovFocus, hosted by GovCIO Media and Research. I'm your moderator, Anastasia Obis, and joining me today is Dr. Matthew Johnson, the Senior Technical Advisor in Responsible AI at the U.S. Department of Defense's Chief Digital and Artificial Intelligence Office, and James Bench, Vice President of Technology Consulting Services at Maximus. Today, we're going to be discussing how to combat AI bias in defense. We're seeing in real time how artificial intelligence is starting to dominate our daily lives, especially with some of the capabilities around ChatGPT and other tools. These tools are providing us with great possibilities, but with that come great responsibilities. Guided by the recently released Responsible Artificial Intelligence Strategy and Implementation Pathway, the Defense Department is ramping up its AI development within its new Chief Digital and AI Office to bring the technology to scale. And as defense AI leaders are implementing the technology across the department, they're working on limiting biases, maintaining ethical standards, and developing algorithms responsibly. Matthew, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, certainly. So as you mentioned, I'm the Senior Technical Advisor on Responsible AI at the CDAO. So I work on a team that our activities are many and varied for helping raise awareness of and implement responsible AI across the department and services. So this is anything from industry and academia and allied partnership calls, acquiring different tools and software, developing ethics frameworks and trainings and documentation for supporting responsible AI. A lot of it involves going out and talking to developers and operatives and understanding what the RAI issues look like on the ground and how we can better support that. Lending support to projects as they're thinking through responsible AI issues. So the mandate is wide and varied, as is our team's experience. My background's in philosophy and cognitive science. We've got people from various kinds of technical backgrounds, data scientists, engineers, human factors researchers, people with experience with kinetic ops, and so it's just every day is new, but with the kind of wide set of experiences and domain expertise from the team, there's always a unique angle to bring to it. So, yep.
James, could you tell us a little bit about what you do?
So James Bench. I'm Vice President of Technology Consulting Services at Maximus. At Maximus, I really lead a lot of our capability around digital modernization, implementing, artificial intelligence systems inside of, full stack, software development. So we're kind of driving a lot of the innovative, mission-driven, focused work that we do for our clients in the federal sector. That includes, really anything related to customer experience, implementing artificial intelligence solutions inside of kind of mission-driven, applications and software. And we'll do that either, within cloud deployments or, really kind of moving the needle forward around, implementation best practices.
So to start us off, Matthew, from a government standpoint, what do we need to know about ethical AI? What does responsible and ethical AI really mean?
Yeah, so I'll speak from the perspective of the DOD AI ethical principles, and I'll just give a quick overview of the history and how we got here and how we're operationalizing them. All the documents I'm going to mention are public, so if you're interested in reading more, they're all out there. So in October of 2019, the Defense Innovation Board released a report. It was the result of a 15-month public study and stakeholder engagement process that involved the DoD, the U.S. government, private sector, academia, and civil society. And they basically recommended principles for AI ethical principles for defense, and it built upon the Department of Defense's existing ethical, legal, and policy frameworks. So these are things like the U.S. Constitution, Title 10 of the U.S. Code, the law of war, privacy and civil liberties protections for individuals, and longstanding international norms and values. So these were proposed. The DoD formally adopted them in February of 2020 in the DoD AI Ethical Principles memo. And what was at the time the JAIC, the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, now the CDAO, was designated as the lead to coordinate and implement the principles. So the principles were basically just kind of really high level guidance. There were 5 of them, and the U.S. was really a leader in this space in that they were the first military to adopt AI ethical principles. And since then, we've had a number of allies follow suit. And so we're really looking to continue to lead in this space. Trust is obviously key to everything we do. Trust of the American public, trust of the warfighter, trust of our allies. So we're really committed to continuing to lead and implement with these responsible AI and ethical principles to reflect our democratic values, strengthen our national interests, and influence global norms for responsible AI. So in order to translate these kind of really high level principles and guidance into like concrete practices and resources, in June 2022, the Deputy Secretary of Defense signed the RAI, or Responsible AI Strategy and Implementation Pathway. So there's basically 64 different lines of effort that are outlined for operationalizing these ethical principles and developing resources and pathways for responsible AI within the department and services, while ensuring agility, scalability, and speed of deployment. So my team's responsible for coordinating these 64 different lines of effort, and they range everything from developing software tools to address different RAI-related issues like bias identification and mitigation, privacy, explainability, different educational resources to be upskilling our workforce with a better knowledge of RAI and how to address these issues. And also building a community across industry, academia, and our allies for responsible AI.
Yeah, I'll add in that some of the reasons even this topic exists is this space alone isn't really long-standing. So artificial intelligence, data mining, has been around for quite a few decades. However, it's definitely entered into the news space pretty commonly now, and it's becoming a very exciting space. But what's also happening is that they're seeing the exploits or the vulnerabilities of the bias and decision making that's happening within the models themselves. And so you're seeing it overall in the news, how people are tricking ChatGPT into even though it has guardrails built in, because they're not trying to make it very they're not trying to make it very politically driven. But people are able to hack the system, through, curated prompts, and then making it, break the guardrails. And the bias and ethical challenges inside of, in these AI models are really hard. Some of them are, it's easy to understand when the decision making is going to be based off of, human, benefits or medical procedures. That inherently, like, there's going to need to be a real focus on bias and ethics in it. I think one of the examples when you're looking at the DoD is that just really, if you're developing models and your data source is just data from the military personnel, you're going to find that, in the DoD, over 70%, about 70% of the entire military force is white. About 20% are Black, and then you have other minority groups. And so if you're developing a model based off of just the raw data, just from the military force and nowhere else, there's inherent bias going to be built into the system. There's less than 20% females in there. And so you're going to have a lot of biasness in decision-making that kind of point itself toward a white male is probably, all things being equal, you may have models that are, saying that a white male is probably better to be recruited because there happens to be more of them today. And that's what the data is trained on, or they're more likely to get promoted because that's just kind of where the data looks like today. That is who is getting promoted today, because it's just by the numbers of the staff that are there. And this is not, I wouldn't say that this is definitely not a simple challenge to resolve ethical challenges inside of AI models. Every model, whether it's resulting in minority groups or not, does inherently have some bias in it. And really, a lot of these efforts and these ethical principles are really just to say, hey, draw attention to it, make sure it's a focus, make sure you have a way to identify is the problem statement that you're doing has inherent bias in it. And if it does, what does that mean in the decision-making that's coming out of it?
Yeah, Matthew, anything to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. So what James is talking about here with this great example of kind of sampling or in processing bias actually lines up really nicely with one of the principles I think that's probably most relevant to our discussion today. Although all five are relevant in different ways, which we'll probably touch on later. But we have this principle of equitability, which says the DoD should take deliberate steps to avoid unintended bias in the development and deployment of combat or non-combat AI systems that would inadvertently cause harm to persons. So I think what James is pointing to here is this really helpful example of what Kathy O'Neill calls pernicious feedback loops, right? Where it's kind of like if you have bias in how you're kind of ingesting the data and represent it in your data set, that's going to be baked into the algorithm, and then that's going to feed back into the overall kind of structures, and it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And obviously, the diversity of our workforce is a huge strength, and so this is a really significant area in which we're really committed through our kind of recruitment and promotion processes to really being able to leverage that diversity fairly. So yeah, that's something we're really committed to. And there's a lot of interesting questions there, right? It's not totally a software issue you can just solve with better bias mitigation techniques, right? It's a issue that has to be approached holistically and structurally. Right, because with those kind of sampling problems, a lot of that has to do with how you get your data in the first place, what you're measuring, what makes it in, how you do your ontologies. And those are questions that are really interdisciplinary, right? We can't just be having data scientists sitting around and hashing it out. We need people with different qualitative experience, research experience, who can use a variety of methods for gathering different sources of data with which we can be critiquing our data sets. We need methods for stakeholder engagement, to be looking at people who have the kind of lived domain expertise that can feed into these things. And these are all things that exist and that we're building out further. But yeah, thank you so much for that example, James. It's really perfect for kind of launching this discussion.
Yeah, it's been as AI is getting more prolific in our kind of everyday lives, in our cell phones and Alexa and everyday assistants and chat. It's starting to highlight, I think, some of these challenges, and it's making it more important to then focus on it. It has actually become even more difficult only because the models that are being developed today, the level of sophistication because of the compute power we have now is growing, like crazy. And what it's doing is it's creating these models that also make it hard to be, one of the principles was traceability, meaning like, how is this model making a decision? It used to be super easy, back in the easy days of just simple logistic regression, where the coefficients be like, yeah, well, it's making a decision because this is higher weighted than this. And that was really simple. But a lot of, the models today that are far more sophisticated with deep neural networks, it is really difficult to explain how the model came to a specific decision. And I think for how the work that's being, a lot of the work that's being done today in artificial intelligence, most of them are leaning in that direction of using neural networks, using these, deep neural networks that are using different algorithms in place. And it is very hard to explain how it's making its decision, which also makes it hard to know, hey, is the outcome coming out? Is it biased? Is it trustworthy? Is it that? And all you can do is base it off of the data that you trained it on and see that it's testing out well. But if the data source also was inherently biased because of how you got the data, I mean, it is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and Matthew, you already mentioned, but I wanted to talk about the responsible AI strategy and implementation pathway. So what does implementing the strategy look like for the CDAO? And what does it mean for the potential use cases in the defense space?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm really excited about this pathway because I think often you see large organizations issue these principles, and then there's this gap in terms of how those actually get translated into practice. And it's a really hard thing to do, actually, particularly you know the people who are closest to these issues and closest to the technology. They can't just have like a 1 hour training or just be told you know you have to implement these principles, right? They actually need the tools and the culture and the organizational processes and the community that can support that. And so across these 64 different lines of effort that I mentioned, we're trying to build all of that resourcing. So we're trying to build tools, software tools, you know, that can be integrated easily into the MLOps pipeline. But also documentation and artifacts like data and model and system cards that allow greater kind of understanding of the limitations of certain data sets, what's out of scope for them, and the bounds and potential risks and things like that. And then also tools like just ethics frameworks, risk mitigation frameworks, impact assessments, and things like that. Basically, all of the tools you need to be able to implement these principles, so that they're kind of you have the resourcing at a more concrete level. And along with that, you know, we're developing different trainings pitched at different personas or roles, and at varying levels of kind of technical background and time commitment, and then also partnerships. As I mentioned, I think what we're really leaning on here is drawing from all the great work that's already being done in industry and academia and with our allies, and we're trying to bring our expertise and context to it, and then really kind of coordinate and lead in this area. And you know, it's something where I think we can draw from industry and academia, which have a lot of advantages in terms of agility. But if you look at kind of the pace of technological development, a lot of that has come from DOD investment, right? From the funding, from the kind of priorities and the kind of high impact nature of what's going on. But also, you know, we are beholden to the American public in a way that you know, sometimes isn't the case for other industry organizations. So we are also hoping to lead in the space of best practices, right? And so yeah, so that as we kind of set these processes for the department, then those organizations that partner with us, it's easy for them to adopt what we already have, and then that can kind of spread its way throughout all of our partners within industry and academia. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, James.
It is interesting, right? Matthew points out, you know, like the DoD does, you know, kind of do a lot of innovation and research, you know, that tends to like then feed back into the commercial space, and then vice versa. The commercial space can take portions of that, you know, and evolve it in different ways. But the driving factors between both, you know, what is happening on the government side and the commercial side are different drivers. You know, the United States is, you know, driven by the Constitution, and there are protected groups by law that they need to, you know, support in the development of all of, you know, any research that's happening. On the commercial side, it's much more financially driven and not altruistic. And then the altruism between, like, you know, what a company is going to do is highly dependent on its leadership, and that varies. You know, that they all, you know, will push toward, you know, ethical evaluation, but depending on the size of the company and where they are financially, you know, they'll have different cost drivers that drive different areas of innovation. And so it can definitely be this feedback loop, a partnership, you know, between, you know, the industry and the government, where each one is feeding each other, like how they're moving forward. And so they can push each other forward. You know, ethical AI, where, you know, in the government side is, you know, definitely making sure that protected groups are there. But on the industry side, the driven need for ethics is, even though it's not quite as solid as the Constitution, it's there usually as a risk mitigation for lawsuits for unfairly treating a different protected group. So the drivers are different. Hopefully they'll continue to work together to make sure it's in support. But at the end, the goal hopefully is still the same. Irregardless of what is the main driver for moving that forward.
Yeah, and James, where are you seeing some use cases for how AI is helping support various missions responsibly?
So when we're looking at it, I think to me, like a fun way of seeing seeing where it's doing well is where it has also failed. Seeing where it's failed can help point you to where it needs to be worked on. Kind of early on, I pointed toward the difference between the DoD's ethnic base being predominantly white versus minorities. And so some examples of is in kind of in recruitment. Kind of a classic example, that is covered a lot is really there was an Amazon recruitment tool that was developed. And what happened was it was abandoned after it was pointed out, its failings was that it was looking at its previous 10-year history of recruitment. And really the previous recruitment was majority of, males. And so the recommendation engine for hiring of who should get screened was also going to be males. And it wasn't actually, based. So once they found that out, they got rid of it. Another area of kind of where it didn't go so hot, of an area that is vastly improving. So one would be the recruitment one, of being, developing your models to be more, diverse. The other one was in really medical treatment. There was this analysis that was done, and they tried to develop the model so that it was more fair. So what they didn't include in the model was race. However, what they started to see was that whites spent more on medical care, which also highlighted that they needed more medical treatment and more care and more focus. And so the biasness, even though it wasn't inherently built into the system, like they were purposely not trying to include ethnicity, it started to come out because that's actually where the money was being spent, because they're more likely to use the system itself. And so those are medical areas, I think, is one area where I think it's being done better, only because of the highlighting of it. The protection of privacy information is improved. And now that there's, better focus on this, space overall, there's a lot more focus in getting that multidisciplinary approach, getting other just non-technical, people that are developing the solution to actually do the evaluation of it to make sure that it's good. And really the kind of the toolkits that are being developed by different, vendor providers and different groups and, research groups. Those are also being used to hopefully try to tease out, where it's needed, where it's, where you're going to have to dig a little bit deeper to make sure that you're not doing something that's unintentional.
Yeah. And Matthew, where are you seeing investments and budgets around ethical AI efforts? Is there any room to grow?
Yeah, definitely. So there's kind of two ways I want to answer this. The first is just to say that we at the Department of Defense see all of the investment in AI as investment in responsible AI, right? And so a lot of that comes down to acquisition and contracting requirements, and requirements we have for how we go about doing development. So the Secretary of Defense, General Austin, has this great quote that's kind of our North Star, where he says, ultimately, AI systems only work when they are based in trust. We have a principled approach to AI that anchors everything that this department does. We call this responsible AI, and it's the only kind of AI that we do. And so I think what this really shows is that, we don't think about AI as being this thing, and then responsible AI is kind of the icing on the top, or something we sprinkle in at the end. Responsible AI is how we bake the cake, how we eat it, and how we serve it, right? Because with the Department of Defense, things can go very wrong and the stakes are very high. And there's also such a diversity of use cases as well, right? Like people are always thinking about weapon systems, right? But as the largest employer in the world, I mean, we have an absolutely enormous supply chain. There's a lot of stuff around predictive maintenance, predictive health. Um, and so with these diversity of cases, we really want to be baking responsible AI into all of the AI, so we get coverage everywhere. And like I said, and like this quote points to, it's really all about trust. And so that's what's motivating the decisions around resourcing and financing, right? Is how do we keep the trust of the warfighter, the American public, our allies? So the kind of more granular answer around where my team, specifically as the RAI team, is making the investments, there's a whole host of different areas I could talk about. I could talk about privacy. I could talk about bias identification, mitigation, human machine teaming, red teaming resources, explainability, documentation, risk management frameworks, training. Like the list is huge, because we're looking end to end throughout the product development lifecycle in basically addressing every RAI related issue that could be relevant across like this enormous range of possible use cases due to the diversity of the work at the DoD. I'm going to focus in particular on data because our chief, Dr. Craig Martell, he's made it the highest priority of his tenure to get the data right. So his kind of guiding North Star to us is this quote he always says, where he says, if we can get the data right, the AI will come for free, but it's not going to happen until we get the data layer right. And I think a lot of these great examples James has brought up have to come in with this kind of like garbage in, garbage out, or self-fulfilling prophecy things we've been talking about, right? And so there's just so many areas in which this can go wrong, particularly because the DoD is sitting on so much data, right? And many of these issues we talked about that relate to bias around sampling bias, different biases of the humans who are in the loop, so they kind of aren't attuned to some of the outputs that may have issues. And so I think like what's important to remember here is this focus on the data itself doesn't have to be and shouldn't be wholly on the quantitative data, right? There's also an importance here in getting these kind of qualitative approaches to the data, which can supplement our quantitative picture right as well. And so what I'll point to is there's an ethnographer named Trisha Wong who has put up this concept of thick data alongside big data, right? And so one of the problems with data is it really only captures what you're measuring and how you operationalize it and are understanding it. It only tells a picture of what you're measuring, right? Which means that if you have gaps, you don't know about them, and that's a lot of the ways that the bias gets baked in. So just as an example, I'll finish with like Meg Mitchell had this great paper with some others in 2016 on image classification, which is about how what's not in the data sets can actually encode the bias, right? So commonly it'll be specified woman doctor, but we don't specify like man doctor, right? And so it's what's not there that can encode the bias. So where does a lot of this future investment need to go? It needs to go in some of these areas that are overlooked, right? Like some of these kind of more outside the box questions around how is what's not in the data set encoding the bias, or like as another example, when you look at a lot of vendor tools for bias identification and mitigation, they're looking at one protected characteristic at a time, right? They're cutting it according to gender, race, income level, but they're not thinking about it in terms of like intersectionality or multidimensionality, right? Like it might be that your algorithm is totally fair across Black people and white people and across men and women. But then it may be that if you load up on the two dimensions of Black women, you suddenly have a result about unfairness, right? And so that's something where, kind of like I said, expanding the teams out in these more interdisciplinary directions, drawing from lived experience and domain knowledge, and having the kind of social scientific skills to survey that. these are all things that we've built out this capacity and are continuing to build out the capacity, so that it's not just a whole bunch of people in dark rooms in front of keyboards, but actually really thinking about these issues holistically. And these are areas in which we want to continue building out the capability.
Yeah, I think for groups, it could probably seem overwhelming, once you're in, working in the space itself, that, once you're having to consider those, kind of like this matrixed information, trying to put things together to say, hey, now is there inherent bias, could a lot of times feel like, oh, well, maybe it's not worth doing because it's too difficult. And it is worth doing. I think when people are developing these, you just have to have, kind of your eyes wide open that, in some way, whether you intend it or not, there is, you have to look at it to just assume that there is some inherent bias baked into it, even though you may not initially see it. But the way to improve it over time is just to know that when you're developing these models, you cannot be afraid to toss it out as soon as it's not good. These are meant to be tuned over time. It's meant to be improved over time. And this is an iterative process. It is not I developed the one model, it's going to sit there for 30 years, like an archaic monolithic system. It is not. It is meant to be continually improved, tuned. You need to watch it. You need to continually, improve it and not be afraid to throw it away. I think with a lot of these models, I think that's the main thing you need to remember is that you can't assume it's perfect the day it went live. It is not. You're meant to monitor its efficacy. How good is it? Is it still doing what it's intended to do? Is it deteriorating over time? And that is a process you just have to assume with this as well. And therefore, as you starting to see bias starting to creep into the system, or it's there that it was always there and you just finally noticed it, fix it, get a new one deployed out and keep looking at it.
Right. And just the last question for the two of you. Looking ahead, how can public-private partnerships further ethical AI efforts, and where can those partnerships make the biggest impacts?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because when I was talking about our chief earlier, Dr. Craig Martell, there's a reason why they appointed a former exec at Dropbox and Lyft to run the CDAO, right? And it's a kind of recognition that our strategic advantage is going to be through partnership with industry, right? Their agility, their innovation, partnership with the best that emerges there, and that's something that under his leadership, it's really been a force multiplier. His experience there and the ability to form these partnerships even more closely. So he uses this concept of what he calls a marketplace, which he says is infrastructure that allows the work of industry to write back into the DoD environment to build a virtuous cycle. And this was the kind of virtuous cycle that James was talking about earlier. And it's really this idea that industry can bring us a whole lot of really exciting innovation really quickly. And we also bring innovation through the kind of uniqueness of our context and our use cases and the crazy amount of brain power we have on the DoD side. But then also the best practices that we have because of our accountability to the American public, the warfighter, our allies. And so we're really excited about these public-private partnerships and yeah, the future. I mean, there's a lot of fear around AI, rightfully, because of the risks and a lot of these kind of really scary cases of them going wrong, like James is talking about. But it is continually inspiring to be in this space and to see how driven folks are by the mission. And so yeah, I'm looking to the future, as is the rest of our team, with kind of eyes wide open to the risks and challenges, but also really genuine excitement about how a lot of the risks and things that have gone wrong, we really think we're getting a lot of the tools and processes and partnerships in place to hopefully mitigate against those going forward.
With the work that the CDAO is doing in RAI, I would say that the government is probably leading the way, I think, in setting a lot of these principles and standards and approaches, and those are going to feed back into industry. So they're going to whether they take it exactly as it is, or they're going to take a variation of it and build upon it for their needs. But I think that governance model, the structure, the thinking around it, that's far more formalized and probably way more invested than a regular industry company would probably, invest in developing it for themselves. That's going to feed back, into industry. But then industry gets to build, a lot of the tools, has access to different types of data, but also huge quantities of it, building the tools and libraries that then feed back and then get built in, to DoD systems. So that feedback loop is there. It's great that, there's a lot more, knowledge sharing and teaming that is done, now more than ever. A lot of this field is really, trying to get the best and brightest and, work put together to try to move the needle forward. AI right now is definitely its own little arms race right now between the United States and, other countries. So it is imperative that the United States be leading in this space and stay leading in this space. It is where a lot of things are being developed. It's where a lot of, the safety of the U.S. citizen is being, established. And this is all happening right now. It is in the news cycle. There's a lot more happening behind the scenes, and it is imperative that we do this well and we stay ahead and lead the way.
Thank you both so much for joining me today.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.